The cardboard box in Marcus Bennett's arms held almost nothing. A coffee mug with a chipped rim, a phone charger coiled loosely around his fingers, a single manila folder, and a small framed photograph of a 7-year-old girl with 2 neat braids and a gap-toothed smile. He walked out through the front entrance of Bennett Global's downtown headquarters, and laughter trailed behind him from the open office floor above, sharp and unhurried. The kind of laughter people allow themselves when they are certain they have already won. Vanessa Brooks stood near the glass doors, arms crossed over a cream blazer, wearing the quiet, satisfied smile of someone who had just solved a problem that had been irritating her for 3 weeks. Marcus stepped onto the front stairs. The pale October sun caught the concrete railing. He set the box down on it carefully, reached into his jacket pocket, and pulled out his phone. He scrolled to a contact saved under a single initial, E. He pressed call. The line connected on the second ring. His voice was level, almost conversational, without any trace of heat. He said 3 sentences. The last one was 6 words long. Fire every one of them. He ended the call, picked up his box, and walked toward the parking structure without looking back. Within minutes, the building behind him began to collapse from the inside. Before we go any further, if you believe that quiet strength speaks louder than any threat, and that a good father protects more than just his family, take a moment right now to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Stories like Marcus's exist because people like you refuse to look away. And if you want to see how one single dad brought an entire corrupt system to its knees with a single phone call, stay with me. Because what you're about to hear will change the way you think about power, patience, and the price of underestimating a quiet man. Let me take you back to the beginning. 3 weeks earlier, Marcus had been standing at his kitchen counter at 6:15 in the morning, buttering 2 slices of wheat toast and cutting them into triangles because that was the shape his daughter preferred. Amara was 7 years old and had strong opinions about geometry. She sat at the little round breakfast table in her school uniform, her braids fresh from the night before, swinging her legs and telling him a very long and involved story about a girl in her class who had brought a beetle to school in a plastic cup. Marcus poured orange juice into her purple cup, listened, nodded at the right places, and asked the follow-up questions that would keep her talking. He liked hearing her voice in the mornings. Naomi had been the storyteller in the house before, now it was just Amara and him, and he had learned to make the mornings soft in ways he had not known how to do before his wife died. When Amara finished her toast, he zipped her lunchbox and slid a small folded note inside it, the way he did every morning. Today's note said, in his careful block letters, "You are the smartest person I know. Have a good day, baby girl. Love, Daddy." He walked her to the corner where the school bus stopped. She hugged his waist. She said, "Bye, Daddy, love you." He said it back. He watched the bus pull away until it turned the corner, and then he stood on the sidewalk for another few seconds before he walked back to the house. Marcus was 38 years old. He had been widowed for a little over 2 years. His wife Naomi had died of an aggressive form of ovarian cancer that had gone from diagnosis to loss in 9 months. He had spent most of his working life abroad, Southeast Asia, then East Africa, then the Gulf, doing the kind of unglamorous operational restructuring work that required long hours in warehouses and short expectations from clients. He had learned more from those years than from any classroom or boardroom he had ever sat in. He had come back to the United States 8 months after Naomi's funeral because Amara had started asking questions about her mother that he could not answer alone in a rented flat in Nairobi. He needed his family around his daughter. He needed the shape of his own city around her. And when his father called him 3 weeks ago and said, in the low, careful voice the old man used only when something important was moving, that the time had come, Marcus did not ask a single question about titles or offices. His father, Elijah Bennett, had built Bennett Global from a single freight truck in Detroit 45 years earlier. He had been 26 years old when he started, a black man in an industry that had made a point of telling him he did not belong in it, and he had built the company one contract at a time. one warehouse at a time, one impossible-to-argue with delivery record at a time. Until the freight company became a logistics firm, and the logistics firm became a supply chain conglomerate, and the conglomerate became one of the largest privately held companies of its kind in the country. Elijah was 71 now. He was deliberate in everything he did. He had spent the last 2 years preparing for a transition that most people inside the company did not know was already in motion. And he had one condition. Whoever took the seat after him had to understand the company from the ground up, not from above. Marcus agreed without argument. It was the same philosophy that had shaped his own working life. Elijah said one more thing before they hung up. He said, "In order to sit in that chair, son, you have to know what it is to be nobody in that building." Because our people spend their whole lives being nobody in buildings like that one. And a man who does not know what that feels like is not the man to run this company. So Marcus showed up on a Monday morning in plain dark trousers, a simple button-down shirt, and shoes that were clean but not expensive. He introduced himself to the HR coordinator, a quiet man named Greg, as a new operations associate on temporary assignment. Greg handed him a standard employee badge, pointed him toward the 14th floor, and went back to his paperwork without looking up. Nobody looked twice. That was the point. The 14th floor housed the mid-level operations team, project coordinators, data analysts, compliance officers, and a small cluster of administrative staff who handled internal reporting and vendor communications. It was not the most glamorous floor in the building, but Marcus had specifically requested it. The work done there was the connective tissue of the company. If something was wrong with the culture of Bennett Global, it would show up on the 14th floor before it showed up anywhere else. His direct supervisor was a woman named Vanessa Brooks. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, efficient in the way people become when they have held a position long enough to know exactly how little effort is required to maintain it. She wore authority like a tailored jacket, fitted, deliberate, and slightly too tight for anyone else to borrow. She looked Marcus over once when he introduced himself, her eyes flicking briefly to his badge and then back up to his face. She said, in a tone that carried a very thin layer of politeness over something else, "I hope you can handle basic data work. We've had difficulty with placements from this program before." Marcus said that he would do his best. She handed him a stack of documents that were already 3 days overdue and walked away before he could ask any questions. Marcus sat down at the desk he had been assigned. It was near the window, which he liked. He opened the top folder and got to work. The data was a mess, inconsistent formatting, missing source tags, duplicated entries across departments. It was not difficult to fix, just tedious and time-consuming. Before he opened his laptop, he placed a small framed photograph of Amara at the corner of his desk. She was smiling in it, holding a paper flower she had made in art class. He touched the top of the frame briefly and then turned to his screen. A few minutes later, a woman with a smooth voice paused near his desk and glanced down at the photo. She was Paula Simmons, mid-30s, precise, always watching. She smiled and said, "Aw, she's adorable. Daycare on this salary must be brutal, huh?" A man near the coffee station laughed. That was Derek Walsh. Marcus said, "She's in 2nd grade now." He said it without heat, without irritation, without any invitation to keep the conversation going. Paula's smile faded very slightly. She said, "Well, good luck with the reports." She walked away. Marcus looked at his daughter's photograph for one moment longer, and then he turned back to his screen and got back to work. By the end of his first week, he had noticed the social geography of the floor with the clarity of someone who had studied organizational behavior for a living. There was an inner circle, Vanessa at the center, flanked closely by Derek Walsh and Paula Simmons. And then there was everyone else. The distinction was not subtle. Derek was loud, loose with opinions, and had a talent for saying things that sounded like jokes but weren't. Paula was quieter, but more precise. She watched everything and said only what was necessary to stay aligned with whoever held the most influence in the room. By Friday, Marcus had completed 3 assignments that had originally been divided among 4 people. He had not announced this. He simply placed the finished reports in the shared drive with clean formatting and moved on. 2 days later, he overheard Derek telling Vanessa that the consolidated vendor report, the one Marcus had spent 12 hours restructuring, had been praised by the compliance director. Derek took credit for it without hesitation, without even a flicker of discomfort. Vanessa nodded approvingly and CC'd Derek on the follow-up email to senior leadership. Marcus's name did not appear anywhere in the chain. He read the email at his desk, closed his laptop, and went to get a cup of coffee. He was not surprised. He was paying attention. Over the following 2 weeks, a pattern established itself with very little variation. Any work Marcus completed that produced a good result would be claimed by someone else, usually Derek or Paula, sometimes Vanessa herself. Any process that went wrong, a delayed response, a misrouted file, a miscommunication between departments, would find its way to Marcus's desk as his fault, regardless of whether he had been involved. The floor had a well-worn system for this. Errors needed a name attached to them before they reached Vanessa, and the name attached was almost always a person with the least standing to push back. Marcus was that person. He had chosen to remain that person, for now. He stayed late most nights. Around 9 or 10 in the evening, when the office had thinned out, he would step into the empty stairwell and call his daughter. Amara was staying with his mother in the evenings while he worked these long hours. She always picked up on the second ring. "Daddy," she would say. "Hey, baby girl, when are you coming home?" "Soon, very soon. You said soon yesterday." "I know. I'm sorry. Tomorrow I'll be earlier, I promise." "Grandma made rice, that's good. Did you eat all your vegetables?" "Some of them." "Daddy, I made you a picture." "Yeah?" "Yeah, it's you. I'll show you. I can't wait." "Okay, I love you." "I love you more, baby." He would end the call, stand in the stairwell for one more breath, and then walk back to his desk. There were moments that were harder to absorb than others. One afternoon, a compliance analyst named Ruth, a woman in her early 30s who had been at the company for 6 years, made a minor formatting error in a regulatory submission. The error was small and easily corrected. But Vanessa called it out in the middle of the open floor in front of the entire team, her voice carrying enough edge to make sure everyone heard. Ruth sat very still, her face controlled, and said, "Yes, I understand. I'll correct it immediately." After Vanessa walked away, Ruth stared at her screen for a long moment without moving. Marcus watched that moment from his desk and filed it away alongside everything else he had been collecting. What struck him was not the correction itself, but the way Ruth absorbed it. The practiced stillness of someone who had learned that any visible reaction would be used against her. He had seen that stillness on many faces in his life, in many places. He knew what it cost. There was also a quieter kind of cruelty that ran beneath the surface. Lunch plans made just loudly enough for Marcus to hear, then finalized in a way that made clear he was not included. Questions directed at him in meetings that were designed not to gather information but to expose gaps, phrased carefully, publicly, so that any stumble became a data point in the running case against his competence. Derek had a particular habit of leaning back in his chair during team calls and saying things like, "Marcus, did you actually put this together yourself?" "The style feels a little different," he would smile after he said it. He would look around the room. Requests would arrive at 4:50 in the afternoon for deliverables due by the following morning, never with enough context to complete them cleanly, always with enough ambiguity to assign blame if something went wrong. None of it rose to the level of a formal complaint on its own. That was the sophistication of it. Each incident could be explained away individually. Together, they formed something much more deliberate. One night in the middle of the 3rd week, Marcus came home later than he had planned. Amara was already asleep on the couch with her mouth slightly open, a picture book open on her chest. His mother was in the kitchen. She looked at him, said nothing about the hour, and made him a plate. He ate at the counter. He was carrying Amara up to her bed when she stirred and blinked at him and put her small hand on his cheek. She said, in the sleepy, unfiltered voice of a child who had been thinking about something before she fell asleep, "Daddy, do the people at work like you?" He stopped in the hallway. He stood very still. He said, "It's complicated, baby." She looked at him for a moment with the terrible, clear-eyed patience of a 7-year-old who had already learned that grown-ups say complicated when they mean the answer is no. She said, "You should find nicer people." Then she put her head down on his shoulder and went back to sleep. He carried her to her bed. He tucked her in. He sat on the edge of the mattress for a long time in the dark and did not move. Marcus ran 5 miles most mornings before the sun came up. He had learned, years ago, to use the early hours for thinking, not just for exercise. On those runs, he processed what he was seeing without the noise of the office around him. He had gone into this arrangement expecting to find the ordinary friction of corporate life, politics, inefficiency, the occasional personality conflict. What he was finding instead was a managed ecosystem. The bullying on the 14th floor was not casual, and it was not disorganized. It was institutional. It had a structure. It had a hierarchy. It had a shared understanding among its participants about what was permitted and what was protected. People lower in the hierarchy either participated or stayed silent, because silence was the only form of neutrality the environment allowed. He thought about his father's company, not as a chairman's son, but as someone who had spent years studying organizations. A company could have excellent products, strong financials, and a well-regarded brand while rotting in the middle, floor by floor, team by team, one silenced employee at a time. Elijah had said, more than once, that a company's real value was not on the balance sheet, but in whether the people inside it trusted each other. Marcus had understood that as a principle for most of his life. He was only now seeing what it looked like when the opposite was true. And he thought, running through the cool gray streets before the traffic began, about what his father had told him. Our people spend their whole lives being nobody in buildings like that one. He had been living inside that sentence for 3 weeks. Now, before we get to the moment everything changed, and trust me, what happens next is the reason you clicked on this video, do me one small favor. If you're feeling something right now, if Marcus's story has already reached somewhere inside you, drop the word respect in the comments below. It tells us you're the kind of person who values quiet strength. And it helps this story reach every parent, every professional, every human being who has ever been made to feel invisible. And if you haven't yet, subscribe, because the next 20 minutes are going to show you exactly what happens when a man who has been watching, waiting, and remembering finally decides that patience is over. Let's continue. In his 3rd week, Vanessa assigned him to lead the documentation for a sensitive internal data audit. It was more responsibility than anything he had been given before, and he took it seriously. He built the tracking system from scratch, coordinated with 3 separate departments, and had the initial framework ready 2 days ahead of schedule. He shared access with Vanessa and Derek so that the broader team could continue building on it while he completed the final sections. It was a reasonable and professional decision. He would come to understand later exactly how it was used against him. On a Thursday morning, Marcus arrived at the office to find Derek and Paula already in Vanessa's glass-walled office. The blinds were drawn, which was unusual. HR Director Sandra Pruitt was also there, seated across from Vanessa with a folder open in front of her. Marcus had barely set his bag down when Sandra stepped out and asked him to come in. Her expression was the practiced neutrality of someone delivering information they did not write. Vanessa stood to the side, arms folded. Derek sat in the corner with the specific stillness of a person who already knows how a scene ends. Sandra told him that a significant volume of restricted client data had been accessed and extracted from the audit system over the past 48 hours. The activity had originated from the access credentials Marcus had used to build the tracking framework. There was, she said, a clear audit trail. The company's position was that a serious breach of data security had occurred, and given the evidence, they could not in good conscience continue his employment. Marcus asked, calmly, if he could see the audit trail. Sandra looked at Vanessa. Vanessa said the documentation was being held by the legal department pending further review and that it was not available to him at this time. Marcus asked if there was a process for contesting the decision. Sandra said that given the nature of the incident, the termination was immediate and final. She slid a single-page document across the desk and asked him to sign it acknowledging receipt of the termination notice. Marcus looked at the document for a moment. Then he signed it. He asked for a copy, which Sandra provided. He thanked her. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at Vanessa or Derek. He picked up his bag and walked back to his desk. The floor was very quiet. People were watching without appearing to watch. He opened the small cardboard box that Sandra had left beside his chair. He placed his coffee mug inside it. He placed his phone charger inside it, coiled neatly. He placed the single folder inside it. And then, last, he took the framed photograph of Amara from the corner of his desk and placed it carefully on top of everything else, face up. As he did, he glanced up. Ruth was watching him from her desk, 3 rows away. Her face was very still. Their eyes met for 1 full second. She did not smile. She did not nod. But something passed between them that did not need any of those things to exist. Marcus picked up the box and walked toward the elevator. He rode the elevator down to the lobby. The doors opened. He crossed the marble floor. He pushed through the front doors of Bennett Global and stepped out into the afternoon light. And then, at the top of the entrance stairs, he stopped. The glass doors behind him reflected the pale sky and the shape of a woman standing on the other side of them with her arms crossed and a small, satisfied smile on her face. Marcus did not turn around. He set the cardboard box down on the concrete railing. He looked, for a moment, at the photograph on top, at his daughter's face, at the paper flower in her small hands. He took a breath. He reached into his jacket pocket, and he pulled out his phone. He scrolled to a contact saved under a single initial, E. He pressed call. The line connected on the second ring. His voice was level, unhurried, and entirely without anger. He said 3 sentences. The first was an instruction to contact the general counsel and convene the board within the hour. The second was a request to have the full digital record of the 14th floor, every email, every access log, every performance review for the past 4 years, placed under immediate legal hold. The third sentence was 6 words long. It was the one that would echo through every corridor of that building before the day was over. Fire every one of them. He ended the call. He picked up his box. He walked toward the parking structure without looking back. He did not drive straight home. He drove instead to the small brick elementary school 3 blocks from his mother's house. He parked across the street, cut the engine, and sat in the car with his hands on the wheel. It was the middle of the day. Recess had just started. He could see through the chain-link fence to the small blacktop playground where a knot of second graders were playing a chaotic version of tag. He found her almost immediately. Amara was in the center of the group, her braids swinging, her small body running full tilt with her hands out. She was laughing. He watched her for maybe 40 seconds. He did not get out of the car. He did not call to her. He just watched her run. Then he started the engine, turned the car around, and drove home to change his shirt. 40 minutes later, he was back inside Bennett Global. This time he did not enter through the front lobby. He took the executive elevator from the private parking level, used the access code his father had given him on his first day back in the country, and rode it directly to the 32nd floor, where the boardroom and the executive offices occupied the entire western face of the building. The view from up there looked out over the city in a way that the 14th floor never did. Marcus had always thought that was part of the problem with how most companies were structured. The people at the top spent too much time looking outward and not enough time looking down at what was happening inside. Elijah Bennett was already in the boardroom. The old man was standing at the head of the long table, not seated, because Elijah Bennett did not sit in meetings when he was agitated. He was dressed the way he had dressed for 45 years, a dark charcoal suit with no tie, his white hair trimmed close, his posture carrying the particular straightness of a man who had spent his entire life not giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing him bend. He looked at his son when Marcus walked in. Something in the set of his expression shifted, not quite relief, but something adjacent to it. Martin Cole, the general counsel, was already there with 2 members of the legal team. 2 board members had dialed in remotely and appeared on the screen at the far end of the room. Sandra Pruitt, the HR director who had delivered Marcus's termination notice barely 3 hours earlier, had also been summoned. She sat at the far end of the table with the careful composure of someone who understood that her position in this room had changed significantly since that morning. Elijah did not open the meeting with pleasantries. He confirmed that the legal hold was in place, that its security had already been pulled in to run a parallel audit of the data access logs, and that nobody on the 14th floor had been informed of any change. He said, "This is my son. He is your incoming chairman. Everything he says in this room carries the full authority of this office starting now." Sandra's face did not move, but something behind her eyes did. Marcus was at his desk on the 32nd floor by 5:55 the following morning. The city outside the windows was still gray, the early light not yet strong enough to define the skyline. Martin Cole arrived at 6:10 with the completed audit in a bound folder and a second copy on a secure drive. He set both on the desk without ceremony and took the chair across from Marcus. They worked through the findings together for the next 2 hours. Martin walked through each section while Marcus read and asked questions. The full picture was more organized than Marcus had expected, and more damaging. The audit covered 4 years of records, the same 4 years that had been placed under legal hold the previous afternoon. In that time, the group operating under Vanessa Brooks had suppressed the advancement of at least 11 employees through manipulated evaluation scores. 3 of those employees had filed informal complaints through internal channels. All 3 complaints had been routed, whether by design or by the structural failure of the reporting system, back to Vanessa's level, where they were documented as resolved without any meaningful investigation. 1 employee had left the company after receiving a sudden and poorly substantiated negative review that appeared in their file within 2 weeks of raising a concern. Another had been quietly transferred to a different floor after what the records described only as a personnel discussion. The third had accepted a confidential settlement. None of the 3 had been contacted by the company since. Sandra Pruitt's name appeared in 2 of the 3 complaint files as the HR contact, a detail Marcus noted without comment and set aside for a separate conversation. Beyond the individual cases, the data showed a consistent pattern in how project work was documented and attributed. Marcus had witnessed the beginning of this process in his 3 weeks on the floor, the rerouting of credit, the selective inclusion of names and communications to senior leadership. The records confirmed it had been deliberate and sustained. Derek Walsh's name appeared in favorable project summaries at a rate that bore no relationship to his documented contributions. Paula Simmons had served, in effect, as the administrative mechanism of the scheme, managing the internal paperwork in ways that made the misattribution difficult to trace without the kind of systematic review that had never previously been conducted. Vanessa sat above all of it, approving, authorizing, occasionally directing. Her fingerprints were not always on the surface, but they were in the structure. Marcus closed the folder and looked out the window for a moment. Then he asked Martin what the legal exposure looked like if the company chose not to act decisively. Martin said it was significant and growing. The settled employee alone represented a liability that could be reopened if it became known that the company had evidence of systemic misconduct and elected to manage it quietly. The 2 employees who had left after filing complaints were potentially in the same category. Marcus said that was not the direction he was considering. Martin said he understood. The decision Marcus had been turning over since the previous evening was not whether to act. That was already settled. The question was scope. Firing Vanessa, Derek, and Paula was straightforward. The evidence against them was specific and documented. But the audit had also identified 4 other members of the team who had participated in the pattern at varying levels of involvement. Some actively, some through deliberate silence that had protected the scheme rather than disrupted it. Marcus had read each of their files individually the night before, sitting at his desk well past midnight with the preliminary summary spread across the table. 2 of those 4 had themselves been targets of Vanessa's team in earlier years before apparently finding it easier to align with the structure than to resist it. That history did not absolve them. But it complicated the question of what accountability looked like when the environment itself had been designed to make integrity costly. He also considered Sandra Pruitt carefully. Her role in the complaint filings was a matter of record. Whether she had actively suppressed those complaints or had simply failed to escalate them was a distinction the audit could document, but not fully resolve. Marcus decided that Sandra would remain in her position under a formal review process, with the understanding that the outcome of that review would determine her future at the company. It was a harder line to draw than the others, but it was the right one. Acting on incomplete evidence in either direction would set the wrong precedent for how decisions were made under his leadership. He spent another hour with the files before calling Martin back in. He told Martin that the terminations would cover Vanessa Brooks, Derek Walsh, Paula Simmons, and the 4 additional team members whose participation was documented in the audit. He said the language of the termination notices would be specific. Each person would receive documentation identifying the precise conduct that had led to the decision, not a generic separation notice. He said the 2 former employees who had filed complaints and left the company would be contacted directly by the legal team within the week, and that the company would make them whole. The employee who had accepted a settlement would be contacted as well. Marcus said he wanted that process handled with care, not with speed. The goal was to make it right, not to close it quickly. Martin made notes and did not ask any unnecessary questions. Before he left, he confirmed that the administrative suspension notices had been delivered to all 7 individuals the previous evening. Marcus nodded and said he wanted the formal terminations processed by end of business that day. By 9:00, the building had begun to fill. Marcus rode the elevator down to the 14th floor for the first time since his termination the morning before. He had not announced the visit. He walked off the elevator and stood for a moment in the open area near the entrance to the floor, looking at the space, the rows of desks, the glass-walled offices along the far wall, the window bank where Vanessa had stood the previous morning, speaking in the low, confident register of someone who believed the future was organized in her favor. The desks belonging to Vanessa, Derek, and Paula were empty. They would remain so. The rest of the floor was at half capacity. People had arrived, but they were not working. Not really. They were waiting. Marcus walked to the center of the floor and asked if everyone could gather. It took less than a minute. The remaining members of the team arranged themselves in a loose semicircle, some standing, some pulling chairs, all of them watching him with the careful attention of people who had learned that expressions were not free. Marcus did not stand behind anything. No podium, no desk. He stood in the open space of the floor and spoke at a normal volume, which was enough for everyone to hear. He said he wanted to be direct about what had happened and what was going to happen. He told them that the audit was complete, that the termination decisions had been made, and that those decisions were final. He said he was not there to explain himself or to seek their approval. He was there because the people in this room had worked in a particular environment for years, and some of them had been harmed by it. And he thought they deserved to hear from him directly, rather than through a company memo. He said the evaluation system that had been in place on this floor was being suspended immediately, and that every performance record from the past 4 years would be reviewed by an independent HR team before any of it was used for any purpose going forward. He said that if anyone in the room had concerns, documented experiences, or information they had been holding on to, there would be a formal reporting channel open within the week, one that would not route back through any manager. It would go directly to the legal department. And to him. He paused for a moment. Then he added one sentence that had not been in the notes he had drafted the night before. He said, "Nobody in this building will ever again be forced to make themselves nobody in order to survive here. That is the ground I am standing on. That is what my father built this company for. And that is what I am accountable for now." The room was quiet. Then Ruth, the analyst who had been publicly corrected at her desk in front of the entire team, raised her hand. She asked whether the review of performance records would affect decisions that had already been made, promotions that had been denied, roles that people had been passed over for. Marcus said, yes. He said the review was specifically designed to identify and correct those outcomes where the record showed the evaluation had been influenced by the conduct under investigation. Ruth nodded and lowered her hand. She did not say anything else. But something in the set of her expression changed. Not dramatically. Just a slight release of something that had been held carefully in place for a long time. Marcus noticed it. He did not comment on it. But he noticed it. A man near the back of the group, one of the project coordinators who had been on the floor for nearly 3 years, raised his hand next and asked whether people who had stayed silent would be penalized. It was a fair question, and Marcus answered it directly. He said the review was focused on documented participation in the misconduct, not on silence. He said he understood that staying silent in that environment had not been a neutral choice. It had been a survival choice. And that he was not interested in punishing people for calculating what it would cost them to speak when the system gave them no safe way to do so. What he was interested in was making sure that calculation never had to happen again. The coordinator nodded and lowered his hand. A few people around him visibly exhaled. Marcus spent the rest of that morning moving through the building floor by floor. He had not scheduled the visits in advance. He showed up, asked people to gather, and had the same conversation he had had on the 14th floor. What had happened? What was being done? What would be different? And what they could expect from him. Some floors were more guarded than others. Some people asked questions. Most listened. A few looked at him with the specific skepticism of people who had heard promises from leadership before and were not yet prepared to adjust their expectations. Marcus did not ask them to trust him. He told them what he was doing, and he left it at that. In the afternoon, Vanessa called the main legal line and asked to speak with Marcus directly. Martin relayed the message and asked Marcus how he wanted to handle it. Marcus said to put her through. The call lasted 11 minutes. Vanessa did not begin with an apology. She began with context, the pressure she had been under, the expectations from above, the competitive nature of the environment she had inherited when she took the management role. Marcus listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said that he had read the full audit, including the records that predated the most recent incidents, and that the pattern it documented was not a product of external pressure. It was a choice, sustained over 4 years, that had damaged real people's careers and, in some cases, their livelihoods. He said the decision would not change. Vanessa said that she had given the company 8 years. Marcus said he understood, and that the severance terms the legal team had provided were consistent with her contract and with the company's obligations. He thanked her for the call and ended it. That evening, after the building had emptied and the only light left on the 32nd floor was the one above his own desk, Marcus went down to the parking level and brought up the cardboard box. He had not thought to bring it upstairs in the days since. He set it on the corner of his desk and opened it. The coffee mug, the phone charger, the single folder, and underneath them, at the bottom of the box, a folded piece of construction paper he had not noticed when he packed it. He took it out. He unfolded it slowly. It was a drawing. A crayon drawing of a tall figure in a red cape, standing with his arms crossed, a small girl with braids holding his hand. Above the tall figure, in the careful, tilted block letters of a 7-year-old who had recently learned to write in cursive but had gone back to printing for this one on purpose, there was a single sentence. It said, "Daddy is my hero." Marcus stood at his desk with the drawing in his hands. He did not sit down. He did not move. He looked at it for a long time. Amara must have folded it and slipped it into his box the morning of the day he was fired, before school, when he had left the box on the kitchen counter thinking it was just some paperwork from HR. She had been planning to surprise him at dinner, and instead it had ridden down to the 14th floor with him, and then out through the glass doors, and then to the parking structure, and then home, and then back up to the 32nd floor. It had been with him the whole time. When his eyes finally cleared, he took the drawing to the credenza against the far wall of his office and set it up carefully against the lamp so that he could see it from his desk. He would have it framed properly later. For now, it stood on its own. On Saturday morning, Marcus brought Amara to the office. She was wearing her favorite yellow sneakers and a denim jacket she had picked out herself, and she held his hand tightly all the way up in the executive elevator, watching the numbers change. When the doors opened onto the empty 32nd floor, she stepped out slowly, looking around with her mouth slightly open. She said, "Daddy, is this a whole floor?" He said, "It is." She said, "Just yours?" He said, "Just ours." She let go of his hand and walked slowly down the corridor, her sneakers making a soft squeak on the polished floor. In the boardroom, she stopped in front of the long table and the tall leather chairs. She looked back at him. He nodded. She climbed carefully up into the chair at the head of the table and spun in it, once, then twice, then again. Laughing so hard the whole room seemed briefly to fill with the sound. She spun until she made herself dizzy and put her hands on the arms of the chair to steady herself. She looked up at her father, who was standing near the window, watching the city and her in that order. She said, "Daddy, are you the boss here?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No, baby, I'm not the boss." She frowned. "Then what are you?" He walked over to her. He crouched down so that his face was level with hers. He said, "I'm the person who protects the people who work here. That's what I am." Amara thought about that for a moment. Then she nodded, very seriously, as if she had understood something important that she would not be able to explain to anyone at school on Monday, but that she would remember for the rest of her life. She said, "Okay." She spun the chair one more time. Elijah came to the office late that following Friday afternoon. He had not scheduled the visit for any particular purpose. He came, Marcus understood, simply to be present. The old man walked the building with his son for about an hour, moving floor by floor, asking questions and listening to the answers, not offering guidance unless it was requested. On the 14th floor, he stopped and stood for a long time near the window bank without saying anything. He looked at the empty desks along the wall. He looked at Ruth, who had returned to work that morning and was sitting at her desk with a slightly straighter posture than she had held for 6 years. He looked at the coordinator near the back. He did not speak to anyone. He just looked. At the end of the walk, they stood together near the window on the 32nd floor, looking out at the city in the late afternoon light. Elijah said that he had spent 4 decades building something and had been afraid, in the last few years, that it had begun to come apart in ways he could not fully see from where he sat. He said he had built the company with his hands and with his refusal to bend. But that when the company had grown large enough that looking down became uncomfortable, he had stopped looking down. He said that was the failure, not the growth. The looking away. Marcus said he understood that now. Elijah said he did not doubt that Marcus would handle it correctly. Marcus said he was not certain of that. But he intended to stay close to the floor. To keep looking at what was actually happening, not just at what the report said was happening. Elijah nodded slowly. That, he said, was exactly the right instinct. It had always been the right instinct. He had simply stopped trusting it in himself when the company grew large enough to let him forget where it had come from. Later that same evening, Marcus sat at his desk on the 32nd floor with the cardboard box still on the corner of it. He took the coffee mug and set it on the windowsill where the morning light would hit it. He plugged the phone charger into the outlet beside his desk. He took the single folder and filed it in the cabinet against the wall. And then, last, he took Amara's drawing to a small framing shop 3 blocks from the office the following Monday and had it matted in cream and framed in simple dark wood. When it came back, he hung it on the wall directly across from his desk, at eye level, so that when he sat down in the morning and looked up, it was the first thing he saw. The coffee mug, the charger, the folder, the drawing. They were not significant objects on their own. But they were the things he had carried out of a situation designed to make him feel like he did not belong. And there was something worth keeping and having them visible. He thought, sometimes, when the building was quiet, about the day he had walked out through the front entrance carrying that cardboard box. About Vanessa standing on the other side of the glass with her arms crossed and her small, satisfied smile. About the sound of the phone connecting on the second ring. About the 6 words he had said, and about how easy it had been to say them because he had spent 3 weeks preparing, without meaning to, for the moment when they would need to be said. But he thought more often about Ruth's face after the meeting, and about the coordinator's small exhale, and about the way his father had stood on the 14th floor looking at the empty desks without saying anything. A leader was not remembered for the moment they revealed their power. They were remembered for what they chose to do with it, who they protected, who they made whole, and what kind of place they left behind for the people who would still be there long after the names on the termination notices had faded from memory. Marcus understood that now, in a way he had not fully understood before he walked through that front entrance in plain clothes and asked for a desk on the 14th floor. A father, a leader, a man. In the end, they were remembered for the same thing. For whom they refused to be silent for. The work had just begun. But it had begun honestly. And that was the only foundation that had ever held anything of real value together. If Marcus's story moved you the way it moved me telling it, if you believe that quiet strength is the loudest thing in any room, and that the best fathers are the ones who protect not just their own children, but every person who has been made to feel invisible, then do 3 things for me before you go. First, hit that like button. It costs you nothing, and it tells us that stories about dignity, resilience, and real leadership matter to you. Second, subscribe and turn on notifications, because we release stories like this every week. True-to-life stories about ordinary people who refuse to stay small. And third, tell me in the comments, what would you have done in Marcus's shoes on those front steps? Would you have made that phone call? Would you have said those 6 words? Or would you have walked away and let the system win? I read every comment, and yours might be the one I feature in our next video. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. There are millions of Marcuses in the world, quietly holding up families and communities without ever asking for credit. This story was for them, and it was for you. Until next time, stay quiet, stay steady, and never let anyone make you nobody. See you in the next story.